Why is Godwyn the Golden turning into a grotesque mermaid-like creature? It's a question that I've had ever since first coming to the revelation that this misshapen corpse in the deeper depths was once Marika the Eternal's golden child. And I'm definitely not the only one wondering about this, as a quick Google search shows this question to be one of the most prevalent points of discussion in all of Elden Ring's lore. And as such, there are lots of interesting and plausible theories to try to explain Godwyn's bizarre mermaid metamorphosis. But what if I told you that thanks to some random messages from fans in Japan, I stumbled across a new, disturbing, and convincing origin point for Godwyn's fishy transformation? I welcome you, Tarnished, to join me, Zayf the Scholar, as I take you on a journey covering all of the prominent theories regarding Godwyn's mermaid metamorphosis, and reveal some bizarre bits of history that likely inspired his grotesque design. Let's talk about it. For those of you who follow my channel, you probably know that Godwyn is one of my favorite subjects in all of Elden Ring's lore. And I mean, what's not to love, right? He's pretty much a textbook example of a Lovecraftian eldritch horror. A demigod, once referred to as a scion of Marika's golden lineage, transfigured into a soulless husk that's so misshapen and deformed that it's almost impossible to comprehend. And easily at the top of the list of Godwyn's curiosity-inducing deformities has to be his giant mermaid-like tail. Why did his assassination transform him into a mermaid of all things? Well, before we get into the weird new stuff that I found, I think it'd probably be useful to first cover some of the ideas and findings that have already been floating around the community for a while now. And I suggest you get your tinfoil caps ready now, because we're starting with a theory that is almost as undying as Godwyn's body itself. The idea that Godwyn was always a mermaid. As proponents of this idea point out, Queen Marika the Eternal has a strong track record of birthing children with various curses and afflictions. Miquella is cursed with eternal nascency, while his twin sister Malenia is afflicted with the scarlet rot. Mohg and Morgott, meanwhile, were born Omen, a race of creatures characterized by their outgrowths of horns that harken back to the now maligned primordial crucible, where all life was once intertwined. And in the DLC, we learn of Messmer the Impaler, Marika's child who was born afflicted with flames and an abyssal serpent. So the question becomes then, was Godwyn for some reason spared from these curses? Or was he perhaps born with some sort of affliction as well? Like, say, having a fishy lower half instead of normal legs. Well, this should be a pretty easy theory to debunk, right? All we need is an in-game model or concept art that shows Godwyn's normal human legs, and we can call this theory dead in the water. But oddly enough, something that seemingly lends this tinfoil idea a bit of credence is that Godwyn's lower half is actually never depicted in official materials anywhere, either in-game or out. For instance, in the concept art from the game's opening depicting his assassination, his legs aren't visible, as they're covered with the same navy-colored cloth that we find draping his cursed mermaid tail in the deeper depths. In the Elden Ring story trailer, meanwhile, we're again only shown Godwyn's head and upper body, presumably in the moments just following his stabbing. Again, all upper body and no shots of his legs. The only seeming exception to this fact is the statue we find at the base of Miquella's Halig tree, which many have taken to depict Godwyn protectively sheltering a young Miquella and Malenia. This statue does in fact have legs. But is this actually Godwyn? Well, as Jack is a Mimic points out in this thought-provoking video in the card, this isn't exactly a foregone conclusion. And if this statue isn't Godwyn, we're reduced to zero depictions of his lower body anywhere. Well, that settles it then, right? Godwyn was always a mermaid. Alright, I'll be the party pooper and say I personally don't really buy into this theory for a number of reasons. Primarily the fact that we have no documentation of it anywhere, and an absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence. Conversely, we are given some lore that would seem to contradict the idea that Godwyn was always a mermaid, including a number of accounts of Godwyn's deeds before his death, like his successful defense of Leyndell during the War of the Ancient Dragons. Or as we learn from the Altus Plateau Sword Monument, the routing of the Ancient Dragons. Godwyn the Golden fought to the last, earning the friendship of Dread Fortisax. If Godwyn were always a merman, I kind of feel like a land-based conflict with the Ancient Dragons would probably have been pretty difficult, barring him slithering around like a snake or something, which admittedly would have been pretty cool. But another thing that seems to contradict that idea is that during Marika's rule, when Godwyn was still alive and well, any sort of animal trait was considered tied to the Crucible and therefore grounds for shunning. It therefore seems unlikely that Godwyn would have been held in such high esteem as a scion of the Golden Bough if he bore such obviously bestial features. But hey, that's just my opinion, and this theory is still a pretty popular one, so what do you guys think? Was Godwyn always a mermaid, or can we explain this another way? I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments, but I do think that there are some other plausible explanations to explore, which we will do next. And for me, one of the most convincing are all of the symbolic ties between water and death in Elden Ring. Everywhere we look in the lands between, we seem to be able to see some connections between water and death. From the Tibia mariners who guide the dead to the graveside plain on their spectral boats, to jellyfish spirits, to coffins littering the underground rivers, to the stone boats and coastal fissure in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC that are filled with putrescent remains. And most relevant to our current investigation is the fact that Godwyn, the Prince of Death himself, has developed many marine-like features in his cursed, transfigured form. We've obviously been focusing on his mermaid tail so far, but that's actually far from everything. Godwyn's eyes, for example, that we see popping up all over the lands between, such as on the decaying roots of the Erdtree, not only resemble the eyes of basilisks, but also look like the eyes of large whales. And speaking of whale-like features, did you ever notice that Godwyn's nose-like appendage on his face looks oddly reminiscent of a whale's blowhole? His visage we find in the basement of Stormvale Castle, meanwhile, has long outstretched tentacles, similar to a jellyfish or squid, while its underside is covered in what looks like multiple rows of sharp teeth, similar to a shark or lamprey.
The misshapen corpse under Stormvale. That is a sacred relic of the Black Knives plot, as that famed night of assassination is known.
It's also clear that the Prince of Death's corpse is surrounded by waters that have turned a poisonous, miasmic purple color, much like the waters surrounding Trina and the aptly named putrescent night. In Elden Ring, therefore, this purple-hued water seems to symbolize putrescence, death, and stagnation. And this concept of stagnating waters is actually super relevant to our discussion, because it ties to Shinto beliefs that inspired and feature prominently in many of Hidetaka Miyazaki's games. In Shinto, everything associated with death and disease is tied to the concept of kegare, which translates to spiritual impurity or defilement. And one primary source as well as sign of kegare are waters that have stagnated and ceased flowing. Conversely, flowing pristine water is associated with spiritual purity. And Miyazaki really seems to like incorporating these concepts into his games. Even elsewhere in Elden Ring, for example, we can see that Malenia, who is afflicted with the Scarlet Rot, a kind of impurity or defilement, is able to hold it at bay using the techniques of her mentor, a blind swordsman who wore blue flowing garments and wielded a curved sword symbolizing fluid waters. The description of the blue cloth set reads, "The garments of a nomadic warrior. The blue color of its fabric symbolizes brisk waters, as fluid and flowing as the sword in the hand of its wearer. Just as still water turns foul, stagnation leads to decay. Warriors must remain ever drifting." And so Godwyn's fly-infested death swamp can be thought of as further symbolizing this dichotomy between flow and purity, and stagnation and decay, or kegare. My friend Last Protagonist has talked a lot about the influence of kegare and other Japanese beliefs in various FromSoft games, like in this video in the card for example, and I highly recommend you check out his channel if you dig that kind of thing. But in any case, I think it's fair to conclude from all of this that these symbolic connections between water, death, and stagnation likely played a part in inspiring many designs in Elden Ring, Godwyn included. But while we're on the subject of Japanese beliefs that inspired Godwyn, Japan does have its own unique lore regarding mermaids in particular, stretching back into antiquity, that I haven't really seen talked about in a lot of detail. Mentions of mermaids in Japanese history actually date as far back as the Asuka period, or 7th century, with reported sightings of creatures being described as neither human nor fish, in both rivers and oceans around Japan. The Japanese word for mermaid, ningyo, is literally a combination of the characters for human and fish, and appears to have first been used in the year 937, where it described a fish-bodied, human-faced creature with a high-pitched, childlike voice. In Japan's medieval period, texts portrayed ningyo as bad omens, or signs of impending misfortune, which is thought to be emblematic of this tumultuous and conflict-ridden time in Japan's history. Myths from the Akita and Tsugaru regions, for example, describe mermaids as omens of impending storms or disasters, or as even the direct cause of these calamities if they're caught or harmed by humans. And this is a common and prevalent theme of all of the tales involving mermaids. Harming them doesn't end well for the people involved. This is very much reflected in the most well-known Japanese folktale involving mermaids, the story of Yao Bikuni, a priestess who, due to her father's carelessness, accidentally consumes mermaid flesh and gains a cursed form of immortality that renders her unable to die a normal death. Mermaids and cursed immortality. Those are already some pretty promising parallels to Godwyn. But one particular variation of this folktale bears even more interesting similarities. So let's talk about the tale of the three cedars of Togakushi. The story goes like this. One day while out fishing, a fisherman comes across a mermaid and decides he wants to catch this rare creature and show it off to his friends. Sensing its imminent danger, the mermaid begs the fisherman to let it go free.
Please, release me. Please.
But the fisherman is very reluctant to let such a rare catch go. A struggle ensues. And in a fit of greed-fueled rage, the fisherman slays the mermaid, butchers its flesh, and takes its meat back home with him, where, partially in shame for what he's done, he hides it away in a storage box. The next day, while the fisherman is out, his three hungry children are scrounging around the house, looking for something to eat. They find their father's storage box, and thinking he had hidden away some normal fish, they cook the accursed meat and consume it. And, almost immediately, begin to undergo a horrific transformation. Fish-like scales begin to sprout out from their skin, and their bodies warp into strange mermaid-like forms, contorting in painful agony. Soon, the children are reduced to nothing but twisted, scale-covered corpses that the fisherman discovers upon his return. Stricken with grief, the man begins to pray. and receives a divine message to save his cursed children's souls from eternal damnation and to repent for his own sins. He's to travel to a place called Togakushi and plant 3 cedar trees, one for each of his cursed children. And once there, he's to devote the rest of his life to praying for redemption. And so, left with little other choice, that's what the fisherman does. He travels to Togakushi carrying his children's cursed remains, where he buries them and plants 3 cedar saplings that grow into massive trees that still attract visitors from around Japan to this day. A grief-stricken parent whose children undergo a cursed aquatic metamorphosis and death, who attempts to purify their curse through the use of massive trees. Maybe it's just me, but that sounds kind of familiar.
Oh, Lord Godwyn. Oh, my poor sweet lordling should have died a true death. A scion of the Golden Bough, sentenced to live in death. How could such a thing come to be?
And so, in Japanese folklore, thematically mermaid flesh represents forbidden knowledge or temptation that irreparably transforms those who consume it, often with a side effect of cursed death or immortality, depending on the story. But very importantly to us, these folk tales and themes surrounding mermaids seem to be something that Miyazaki incorporates into many of his games, since, as pointed out by Zuli the Witch in this video in the card, ideas from these stories can be found in both Bloodborne as well as Sekiro. Kos in Bloodborne, for example, seems to mirror many of these myths, as a mysterious sea creature whose violation leads everyone to inevitable ruin. And in terms of mermaids being associated with unwanted immortality, the divine dragon, a source of cursed immortality in Sekiro, is referred to as Ningyo-ryu, or mermaid dragon, in its game files. So that just about covers the prominent theories that I'm aware of regarding Godwyn's transformation. But as I hinted at earlier, that isn't everything. Because thanks to some messages from fans of the channel in Japan, I was actually led to some new, insanely interesting information that can shed even more light on Godwyn's fishy form. One of these messages went like this. Hey Zayf, have you ever searched up images of mummified mermaids before? Ningyo no Mira in Japanese. You might find some interesting images. Miyazaki and I are actually the same age, and when we were kids in the 80s, books about occultism featuring the paranormal and things like Nostradamus' prophecies were insanely popular. And in those books, I remember seeing photos of mermaid mummies that looked just like Godwyn. Well, that's pretty interesting. Let's just have a look on the old Google image search and see what he's... Oh my god. What exactly are we looking at here? Buckle in, guys, because it's time we learn about the history of mermaid mummies. During the Edo period in Japan, a trend emerged called misemono, which you can think of as being kind of similar to Western sideshows, circuses, or freak shows. In exchange for a small fee, you'd be able to view various attractions, from acrobatic shows to living exotic animals, to exhibits purporting to display dead mythical creatures, including, you guessed it, mermaids. And in part because of the popularity of the story of Yaobikuni, people flocked to these exhibits, believing that viewing these Ningyo mummies could impart upon them protection from disease as well as long life. In fact, it was believed that mermaids were so powerful that even simply viewing drawings of these creatures was enough to give the viewer a longer life or protection from sickness. And that these mermaid mummies actually existed is firmly established historical fact, as several of them were gifted to shrines and temples where they actually remain to this day, preserved as precious artifacts that were once thought capable of granting wishes. Obviously these aren't real mermaids, right? So what on earth are they then? Well, several of these mummies have actually undergone modern scientific analysis in university labs around Japan, which has suggested that these were man-made by highly skilled but also morally questionable artisans, who stitched together the body parts of monkeys, fish, and other animals to create grotesque chimeric creatures that they could sell as authentic mermaid mummies. These then became popular as morbid curiosities within Japan's Misemono culture, but eventually also found their way to the Western world as well. In 1842, for example, famed circus head P.T. Barnum began showing off a grotesque mummified creature that came to be known as the Fiji Mermaid, which proved to be a huge attraction before it was eventually lost in a fire. It's believed by historians that the Fiji Mermaid was likely a Japanese Ningyo mummy, and its popularity led to the emergence of many such mummified creatures making their way west, lots of which are still preserved in museums around the world. And I don't know about you guys, but while none of these mummies are an exact one-to-one match with Godwyn, for me they have to be the most compelling source of possible visual inspiration that I've come across so far. And it's made even more convincing to me by the fact that these were a commonly featured cryptid in the popular occult books and magazines that were likely a substantial part of a young Miyazaki's media diet growing up. And so we loop back to the question, why does Godwyn have a mermaid tail? Well, while not quite a definitive answer, if there ever is one, I'd definitely say we can come to some fairly educated guesses based on all this evidence. Miyazaki and his design team probably came up with the idea to tie Godwyn's design to all of the other watery, death-related imagery in the game, drawing inspiration from folktales surrounding mermaids, and from grotesque mermaid mummies that were popular in the occult books from his youth. I would say it's also possible that the myth of the three cedars, as well as general beliefs about the purifying powers of trees, can also inform our interpretation of not only Godwyn, but also of how Miyazaki and George R.R. Martin created the larger mythology surrounding the Erd Tree and death. Or maybe Godwyn was just always a mermaid. I don't know, man. But what do you guys think? It took a lot of research for me to put this video together, so I hope at least there was something in here that was new for you. But be sure to drop me a comment and let me know what you think either way. If you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hype, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. It really helps out my small channel a lot, and I genuinely appreciate it. And hey, I'd also appreciate it if you considered supporting my work by becoming a patron, a YouTube member, or buying me a coffee. Thanks a ton for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.